This ancient feast is a feast which places very close to our Eastern brethren and the whole of their spirituality, as perceived especially in the monastic sphere. On Mount Athos there would have been all-night liturgy, starting in the vigil and not ceasing all night. This is something precisely which one associates with mountains, separation from hustle and bustle, and the instinct to create places where that exists in other forms and under other modalities has been and always will be amongst human beings until the end of time. Hence it is that in the Celtic West the equivalent of the desert would have been islands, mountains and waste places. A good example in Eastern spirituality of a place of this nature would be a place where on this very day in 1972, it was the 6th of August and it was also a Sunday that year, I climbed and visited. It's meteora, that means meteors, and these are perpendicular rocks on the top of which were built monasteries, and there are still monasteries up there. One is now a nunnery, but the others still in use, if they are male communities. And in days of old, when these were built, it was very difficult to get up there. In fact, it was done, if there was a guest who wanted to visit, by means of a rope and a basket big enough to hold the man. And apparently the rope was only replaced and renewed after it had broken, so it was no incentive to tourists to come and curiously visit. That was how seriously they took setting up Mount Tabor. And in fact, when I was up there on that Sunday morning, I found my way into one of the monastic chapels, and at that particular time I was on my own in it, and one did get an idea of separation from humanity at that height. The ancient icons, the smell of incense, the burning lamps, the simplicity of it, which is not changed because they have not had any change. No council like Vatican II, which altered things, is there placing one in continuity with the generations that had gone by, using those means of glory to conquer eternity. Now, this is evangelical also, and essentially, for the Lord himself gave that model. He took them to a high place apart, two important notions. And we need places apart and high enough to get away. That can mean, in modern terms, not being in touch, e.g. through having the mobile phone on. Times when God truly reigns and has that isolation and space big enough and wide enough for him to have access to all the corners of our soul and mind. Which is where I'd like to leave you just for a few minutes today, that element of places where that has happened in the past and still tendentially happens. There are places where we have met God. There are places where we have been touched. And coming back to those places is already in itself a healing moment. There is a homecoming, peace again. There's a resonance, there's an echo. We know the acoustics of this place, the acoustics of the heart and soul, where there has been an echo of heaven on earth, and we were able, as the Gospel says, to listen to him. Listening to him. There are places where light flows. As we know, when Bida Laffy prays over people who are in light, she sees that light, and that's an indication to her that they're in a good state. If she sees other things, it's the contrary. But there is a light in the presence of God. And there is a lightness also in his presence and in the heart which feels him. There is not necessarily ecstasy, but an inner peace and tingling of quiet joy of being in contact with its source. And without grace there cannot be that joy. A lesson unto all who are looking in the wrong place. All they can do is look elsewhere and elsewhere and elsewhere and elsewhere, but they're avoiding the source. But this question of precisely having spaces where we know we will be met and valuing them is important. Because if they're not there, God is not reigning. We're depriving our own selves of the very source of consolation in our day. Just one thought. Sometimes God himself becomes the prime mover, and things happen even to souls who are not actually looking for him, precisely in sacred places where he is reigning. Just leave you with one story which is true. It happened quite a few years ago now, in at that time still atheistic, officially anyway, Poland. Although of course it never conquered because the church was too strong, but nevertheless the regime was communist. And therefore those who had good jobs had to belong to the party, and that was the case in this particular family, and therefore a child in this family was, like his parents, pretty anti-church. His family, his father in particular, was fairly high placed in the communist regime. One day, by accident, he wandered into a church which was open, which is, by the way, an important issue in itself. The church should be open, because they are points of contact, especially when a soul is alone and wandering in, because God sometimes does hit hard. But anyway, this gentleman, young man, came in, and as it happened, there was adoration going on at that time on the altar. And he came in a spirit of hostility and aggression. And something from the monstrance, of which of course he had no notion, hit him and fulminated him. And he knew and felt and inwardly understood. And he heard, and he did hear this word at that point: I exist and you will be my priest. Now, he did realize that this was something supernatural and he had to listen. So he went away with what had happened, and he would drift back, as one tends to drift back to a place where something has happened in the past. Each time it was still there, but it was, as time went on, each time diminishing in intensity. But the initial oomph had been enough for him to contact the local bishop, who would not believe him, because it was too much of a contact with the Communist Party, which could have been actually some kind of espionage from within. So anyway, he had to insist and explain exactly what had happened, and the bishop did then take him seriously and let him go into the seminary, even though there was a hullabaloo at home, as you can imagine. So anyway, this is to say that when God is on earth, we can expect things to happen. But we need to be careful that we don't, in some way, ourselves occupy the throne of God in his own dwelling place. If that happens, he cannot reign even in his own house. Two things which, unfortunately, do make that happen. One is to concentrate on the exterior, in an exaggerated way, of our prayer, in such a way that the focus is on the execution. It's what is called ritualism, where the rite itself is the centre of attention. The other is the actual, fortunately, common error now of not distinguishing between the radicality of the separation of what is on this side of the front door of church and that on the other side. In classical language, the word used is the profane. Now, pro is before, fanum is temple. So the profane was the area in front of the temple, even in pagan times. Now, if what is therefore in front of the church door, the profane, is on this side of the church door, I mean doing what we would happily do there, in church, then that is something which excludes God from his own kingdom and enthrones man in his place and deprives man himself of the blessings which God had prepared for him. And that is more common, even in our own case, than we think. We start with a whisper and then we engage the vocal cords. Just one slip. So let's bear that in mind, that even though we cannot see, it's all there. And the angels are listening and watching and seeing it all.
When God rent the hosts of heaven, spreads its banner on the way, as the light of light descended from the realms of endless day, that the powers of hell may vanish as the darkness clears away. At his feet the saints winged seraph, cherubim with sleepless eyes, veil their faces to the presence, as with ceaseless voice they cry,